On the agenda today? Seeing none, we start today with a presentation from Jamie Campbell, the Supervisor for Special Projects at the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. Jamie, can you please come forward and give your presentation, after which I'm sure you'll have a few questions if you can stay and answer those questions. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present. I hope you'll find this presentation helpful in answering your questions regarding legislative source water protection roles. Just to review, source water protection comes out of Justice O'Connor's work. Justice O'Connor, looking at what happened in Walkerton, there's a lot of recommendations he made. 12 of them are key to source water protection. There's another 22 at the time, but there's about 12. And the first principle, let's prevent before water gets to the treatment plant any contamination. I hope this graphic will be helpful. My role as project manager at the Conservation Authority is regarded to the Clean Water Act, or SOURCE. Safe Drinking Water Act is yourselves running the municipal water treatment plants. There's a number of other acts and legislation that dovetail all of that. But the Clean Water Act at the left of the slide there, emphasis on prevention, and as part of a multi-barrier approach. One that does seem to be the envy of many of our neighbors. Some of the scope, protecting, first bullet, existing and future sources of drinking water, manage activities that could be a risk, mostly uses existing legislation. The Clean Water Act comes out of some very interesting legal activities where they couldn't sort things out, so they had to come up with new legislation to make this work. And the last bit we'll talk a little bit about, part 4, there were some new powers created on the Clean Water Act that you exercise, and that's your risk management official, Ms. Jen Croswell, who's here with us today. The Clean Water Act uses conservation authorities as source protection areas. This was one of Justice O'Connor's recommendations. Let's manage the source according to watersheds. So that role was given to conservation authorities. About 90% of the population in Ontario through municipal protection have been looked after now, or being looked after as these plans are being implemented. Third bullet's an interesting item. Other systems, private wells, private intakes, and non-residential systems can be added on. There's only a couple in the province where that's been considered. And moving forward, new systems, if you were putting in a new municipal water treatment plant, that would have to be considered and mapped, or any changes, and I'll outline a few of those for you. The map here, Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, the Niagara Peninsula Source Protection Area is 1 in 1. And what I mean to that, as opposed to our neighbors to the northwest, the Halton Conservation Authority, the Hamilton Conservation Authority are managed as 1 in regards to source water protection. Just a little bit of a nuance, just if you're working elsewhere, talking to your partners in another municipality. So there's 38 source protection areas. And again, this is a watershed basis of how this is rolled out. There are no City of Hamilton municipal systems. There are no County of Haldimand municipal systems in our source protection area. There are the 6 Niagara Region municipal water treatment plants. And that's the focus right now. Some of the key players, there is a source protection committee. 1/3 is municipal representatives. So Councillor Paul Grenier is your representative right now. Prior to that, it was Councillor Tim Rigby. And then we have representatives of the City of Hamilton and Haldimand. There's 3 from the public at large, and 3 representing the sectors of agricultural, commerce, and industrial. There's 3 key items. First was the terms of reference. What will these studies look at? There were the 6 municipal water treatment plants. The next is an assessment report, this big technical document, about 20+ studies all squished into one, and that listed off what were the threats we were going to look at and where would they be a concern, and then the source protection plan. This committee, which is hosted by the Source Protection Authority, the Conservation Authority, reviews these documents, had a lot of input, very good group, and looks at annual progress reporting. Down the bottom of the slide, the Source Protection Authority, another name for the Conservation Authority. We appoint the committee. Of course, you appoint the member that represents you, Niagara Regional Council. We provide administrative support. We support implementation, track progress. We work with our implementers of the Source Protection Plan. and we're responsible for looking at plan revisions. And the funding for my position is from the province. I have to apply for that every year, even though it's enshrined in legislation. You are also key players. All the way through in that terms of reference, the assessment report and the source protection plan, we are co-authored. You have some excellent staff in your water group who we co-authored all those documents, and it was a great team effort. There's a number of roles Niagara Region implements, as well as the local municipalities. There's the part for policies, expand on that in a moment, and an ongoing role in plan updates. For example, the Niagara Falls intake. If a backup intake is situated, there will have to be new mapping of that new intake protection zone, and we will work with your staff and get things done according to the provincial technical rules and roll that up into the reports. The province, they provide guidance, they provide funding, they approve all these different documents and items, but we also have policies that direct them to do items. We can't have policies that tell the feds to do anything, but we have policies that make the province do certain things, and that's worked out largely well. A little bit of a few milestones. Back in 2013, that technical report with the zones, threats, that got done. In 2014, legal effect was given to the source protection plan. We were second in the province. Implementation has largely been over the past 3 years. All but one policy had to be done by last fall, and we're in good stead that way. And then we were the first last fall to submit what I'll call Source Water 2.0. We had to submit a plan to the province, to the minister, saying, what are we going to do next? And that's actually what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon at your Public Health Committee. Consultation, always a priority. Certainly, I believe what was given us by the province and what we did was copied by many others in a lot of ways. It was a good thing. Notices being sent throughout, lots of meetings with implementing bodies and landowners, many public meetings, and constantly seeking public comment so we'd have a good buy-in and a good understanding of what we were doing. There's some tools up at the top where it says section 57, 58, 59. Those are new tools. Those are implemented by yourselves or Ms. Croswell where that was necessary. The rest are existing tools, from more restrictive up at the top to less restrictive at the bottom. The Source Protection Committee, along with a working group, sought to be as least restrictive as possible while ensuring protection of municipal drinking water supplies. And also to mention there on that last slide, there are even policies directed to the Conservation Authority that we have to do as well. So there's a lot of people working together on source water protection in Niagara. A lot of text here, it's there for you for reference, but in summary, Ms. Croswell has to work with certain landowners to have risk management plans. Where there wasn't an instrument through the province to make things work, she works with a local landowner to make sure land use activities are not negatively affecting municipal intakes. There's also some prohibition tools. Those have not been used against any existing activities. And the restricted land uses is a fancy way of saying there's a screening process to make sure between, for example, the city of Thorold has a number of these places that have to have risk management plans, so they know and have in their planning processes to work with Ms. Croswell on making sure drinking water is kept safe. Some more details, this is from a slide deck from the province, so it has all the extra details, but again, negotiating risk management plans. There can be activities that are prohibited. She can issue orders and such. And also she has an annual report she submits and provides to us on how those activities are going. In summary, over the province, there's about 450 municipal drinking water systems being protected through these plans. Here we have our assessment report and the source protection plan, and there's annual reporting to make sure these items are kept up to date. This may interest some of you, maybe not. Just comparing the policy tools. In red, that's showing the number of policies used for risk management officials. About 10% of the policies in Niagara are directed through your risk management official, as opposed to closer to a third in the province. The province has about 37% of the provincial policies. We use about 30%. And at a municipal level, about a quarter in the province, about 37% locally. Just a little bit of a feeling that way. Now, we also direct policies to the St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation. We can't make them do anything. They're a federal body. However, all along the way, they have been an excellent partner. We meet with them, we talk with them, and we have a very good relationship with them, and they want to meet the intent of all the policies. They even have in their lease agreements that their lessees have to meet the provincial standards. So that's gone very well, we believe. Road signage, pardon me, that's a mistake there where it says Welland. Niagara Region has made great progress in road signage, as well as the province. You may have noticed signs on 406, as well as in Port Colborne. More coming in Niagara Falls, Thorold, and Welland. Emergency response plans, the ones for Niagara Region have been updated, as well as those for Welland, Thorold, and Port Colborne to consider source water protection. And now there were policies in the source protection plan to do so. Worked well with your fire departments on that. The risk management plans, Ms. Croswell was working on. Land use planning, the official plans for the region, Thorold, Niagara Falls, Port Colborne have been updated, and Port Colborne and Thorold are nearly done their zoning bylaws for that, and there's outreach and education efforts that are ongoing. A little bit about the money. From the province, they tell me they've given out about $280 million, and believe to Niagara, it's been about $6.5 million. So let's break that down. When you look at the population estimates, that's about proportional to your population in Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. And in terms of technical study funding, there's about over $800,000 has been provided to Niagara Region for all the technical studies. There were a lot done and it worked very well, and we're well set up. There's annual progress reporting. That's my priority right now that I have to get done. We take a look at, are the plans being implemented, are the policies being implemented, what are the challenges there? So I receive information for all the implementing bodies, like I'll call up your planning officials at Thorold, Niagara Falls, and Port Colborne and say, how is that going? As well as Niagara Region. And that'll all be written up, and I provide that to a committee in March, and then that goes to the Source Protection Authority Board in April and has to go to the province by May 1st. If you're coming this afternoon to the Public Health Committee meeting, I'll explain this in more detail, but at the end of the day, if the systems change, those have to be reflected in these documents. For example, the intake from Allenburg on the Welland Canal up to the Sioux Falls Water Treatment Plant has been put into pipes in some sections, and more of it will be put into pipes. That will change those intake protection zones and then change the policies that are affecting landowners. So we'll be working with your staff on that. And the third bullet up there where it says 36, that's this mandatory review where we had to submit to the province, what do we think we should do next to improve things? That was submitted last November. In summary, I believe we've had a very successful partnership with Niagara Region, protecting drinking water supplies for over a decade. I just use that as a round number, though it started before that. By virtue of provincial legislation, the Clean Water Act, and by virtue of provincial funding, the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority is the Source Protection Authority, responsible for the Source Protection Committee, and reporting and updates to the plan. And Niagara Region addresses a number of significant drinking water threats as per the Source Protection Plan being to do that, and got the list there of some of those items. So that's a quick overview. I hope that was helpful. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have at this time. This is the signage there on Highway 406 as you head north from Welland, and those have been positioned by the province.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for that presentation. I have a couple people lined up to ask questions, starting with Councillor Burrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it made it more clear, although I do have a couple of questions. This committee, is it a Conservation Authority committee, a Conservation Authority committee? Okay. And what is the total membership?
All right, through you, Mr. Chair. The membership is 10 members.
10, okay.
The chair is appointed by the province. A new chair was appointed earlier this year. They did consult with us, and we did help to facilitate that process, and the new chair was an existing member. The other 9 members of this committee, which is a Conservation Authority committee by virtue of the provincial legislation, they have 9 members, so 3 are municipal representatives, 3 are public at large, and 3 represent sectors. And
okay. We're
at full strength now after some changes that way. Does that answer your question, sir?
It does. And how often, you say they meet regularly, how often is regularly? Every month or?
That is, through you, Mr. Chair, that is a very good question. When we first started off source water protection, they had to meet almost every month. A very, very detailed in the weeds type of work. Since the Source Protection Plan got approved, there was some confusion at the province. We were not given a lot of direction about what steady state looked like. My work plan that I've submitted to the province for the coming fiscal year, because we operate from the April to March, is my vision is quarterly. And right now I'm waiting to receive confirmation that that's what will happen, because this is a paid committee to receive a per diem. That per diem is from the province, and so it operates at the Conservation Authority, but it's funded by the province under a provincial mandate, and then my role is funded by the province as well. So.
Okay, that's great. The other one, it appears that the region does all the enforcement. Is that correct?
No, sir, and pardon me in that end. Well, I guess that, through you, Mr. Chair, that is one answer, wherein a Part 4 power is part of how a threat was sought to be dealt with. Like, give you an example, sometimes it can be, we don't want a landfill in an intake protection zone. That would be accomplished largely through directing the province not to allow an environmental compliance approval there, but then that would also be reflected in the official plan, for example, the local municipality in the region. However, when a Part 4 power was determined to be the right tool, Niagara Region does enforce that. And now other municipalities have deferred that role, sometimes to a conservation authority, sometimes to a local municipality. But yes, you guys enforce Part 4 power policies.
Okay. And the funding from the province, does that go to MPCA or does that go to the region?
Okay. Current funding is for myself and the Source Protection Committee. That comes directly to the Conservation Authority. However, when source water protection started, the technical studies for your 6 water treatment plants came to the region.
Right.
And the region oversaw the request for proposals and all that, but we worked together the whole way through. So supplemental monies for some of the other things that had to be mapped came to the Conservation Authority, but the key funding to protect your intakes from a mapping, a modeling,
Right.
was to the region.
So the funding every year is based on a very specific request?
Exactly, and Niagara, the NPCA is at the forefront of that. We're one of 3 starting the next stage. So we make a funding request before Christmas, they give us a template, and then we work with them, have meetings, and then they inform us whether or not we're fitting their vision for the program or we promote our vision for the program.
Okay, but it's initiated by MPCA.
In response to a provincial request.
Okay, but how does our staff fit in? I guess they're on the committee, are they?
Okay, very good question, and my apologies. The committee also has a number of liaisons, and my apologies on that. Liaisons include Ms. Croswell, makes herself available to be there because she has a very valuable role and is often your point person for the other source water roles, be it policy or education outreach. Your public health group also has a liaison, that's Peter Jekyll, and he's been an excellent member of the team, as well as the Source Protection Authority has a liaison at the moment, that is Councillor Beatty. He fulfills that role as well, creating that connection between the committee and our board.
Okay.
My apologies on that.
And thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I believe, just my days of being on the authority, Mark Neufeld, I think from Niagara and Lake, was the chair of the committee when they did the source protection plan. I remember him coming every other month to do an update on that plan. Is Mr. Neufeld still on the?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Neufeld retired from that position last January, and so he saw us all the way through to the first of all those studies and implementing that. Yeah, so he did an excellent job.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, Councillor Quirk.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Jamie. Obviously, we've seen at the NBC a lot of the work that Jamie and his team has done through the source water protection, and I see Councillor Grenier has joined us. Thanks to him for the work he's done. Jamie, one of the update on the source protection plan, has that been circulated to council here? Have they seen the work that you've done, especially on the mapping side of things with the new source water protection, or is that this afternoon's presentation?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So this afternoon, I was asked to present to the Public Health Committee in response to a recommendation at the Conservation Authority Board last November. Councillor Timms recommended that the Source Water 2.0, the proposal to update be provided to the public health groups because there's a number of good tie-ins there to their group. And certainly if any members of council want to know more, we can facilitate knowing more about that. But certainly your staff are aware, as well as, of course, Councillor Beatty, as well as all the members of the Conservation Authority Board.
So thank you for that. The reason I ask is because just from an infrastructure point of view and public works point of view, the work that you've done with mapping those intake zones, I think is very informative. So if we can make sure that everyone gets a chance at least to see the maps and how those intake zones have changed. And for myself, the information and education on how, like, for example, putting the pipe to the queue is actually making the policies, land use policies, less restrictive because you don't have to worry about flow into the intakes of that water. Source protection is very interesting, as well as conversations we've had about the fact that a large majority of our water is coming from Lake Erie, and we don't really have any control of what goes on in Lake Erie, and that because of the federal input. And there's probably some opportunity to have a greater conversation with some of the motions that have come forward with respect to the Great Lakes water quality here and how that works on our intakes would be useful information as well. So I know if you're going to do that sort of mapping discussion at Public Health today, I think it would be also informative to make sure that we provide that sort of to the committee just as correspondence so people can see the map, because I think it's actually quite interesting the work that you've done, and having a chance to participate in those discussions was eye-opening and education from my point of view. So as soon as that report is available to the rest of council, it certainly informs us on where we put those infrastructure dollars with respect to water management. So thank you very much for the work you and your team have done, Jamie.
Thank you, Councillor Quirk. Councillor Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to Jamie. Just recently, the province, I think, has begun a round of, and it seems it's going to be a lengthy consultation regarding it's about protecting water sources within the Golden Horseshoe, and it seems to be leading toward, they're kind of investigating the use of extensions of the Greenbelt to protect water over the longer term. And so in my role as the chair of the Golden Horseshoe Food and Farming Alliance, I recently was at one of those consultations, and some of the questions around the room were a little bit of question around how Niagara was not actually identified to be part of that investigation. I'm just wondering if the Source Protection Committee has a role or has attended. They may have had representatives there at different consultations, and this isn't imminent apparently. It looks like it's going to take a long time to get to a recommendation, but the Ministry of Natural Resources, Municipal Affairs, and OMAFRA are all working together on it. So I'm just wondering if you have any knowledge of it or plans to get involved. There was some alarm raised that Niagara, was just somehow dropped off of the. There was a metric to try to include areas, and it all seems to be the greater Golden Horseshoe north of Halton and Peel and etc. So I don't know if you have any knowledge of it or plan to get involved or.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I will talk to our acting planning manager because I have not had a formal role and I've not formally been mentioned to that. I am aware of it through some friends, but certainly that has not been mentioned or investigated, but I think that's a good idea to find out, particularly because the Source Water 2.0 is to think about also groundwater, because we were very pragmatic the first time around. We only had policies for municipal protection the first round, and I'm hoping the second round we can assist with the rural population. In NPCA, there's about 17% that are on private drinking water supplies. So I need to find out more, but unfortunately, I don't have anything I can provide you that.
Okay, thank you. I just know that it's important that there be some representation at those consultations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rigby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's certainly nice to see an update on on the source water protection, and I was the councillor on that particular committee that started the process going forward to what is now the Clean Water Act. It's interesting to see, we have a report, PwC 218, and that relates to a report on the operations of our wastewater plants. And the report, I guess the question I should ask first is, have you seen that report?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't believe so, sir.
Okay, all right. It shows there that 5 of our 6 plants have 100% compliance, but only Port Colborne had 2 incidents that happened, or occurrences, I guess we call them. So you may not have seen that as of yet then.
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, and I wouldn't expect to, just
Okay.
because my concern is Clean Water Act source, and it's a fairly full-time job. So the treatment onwards is not part of my scope of my job.
Well, where that occurrence, that was part of the source of the Welland plant and the St. Catharines or DQ plant. So it ends up being that source as well. So I would have thought that our staff would have provide that to you. But I'll ask that question when we come to that item.
Well, if I may, the role is not on a day-to-day operation. Through Mr. Chair, my role, there's lots of things I would like to do, but I have a role that's fairly formal. Committee meetings, move the plan forward. Long-term, I am not a day-to-day response in that. And maybe there needs to be a policy in the source protection plan to respond to that. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't one to that end. Okay, so but I will read that report now, because obviously there's something I need to learn. So
I'm not criticizing you at all. I just I guess what you've run into there is the restrictions that are placed on your responsibility to a certain extent, in that you have set jobs that you do and report to that committee. And going forward, which takes me to the mapping, which when in our work, we were restricted from being able to determine Lake Erie operations or Niagara River operations from the border in. And so I'm not sure your mapping is as was suggested by Councillor Quirk. I'm not sure whether you will be able to extend the mapping out into Lake Erie based on the reports from source water. So just a comment that as you go forward, you may have that same restriction. I don't think they really wanted to deal with American policy.
I don't know the rules, right? Do I respond or not respond? I want to know.
Jamie?
Yeah, sure. I'd glad to, through you, Mr. Chair. My vision is nudging. I don't know if you read that book, that famous, is nudging. Yeah. So certainly the MOECC, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, that oversees the program, are definitely trying to keep a lid on things. Yeah. But my vision is, what can we do with Source Water 2.0 to encourage better behavior for our neighbors? So I'm not so concerned about the zones. Those are part of it. I'm concerned about what role we can play in what's going on with the talk about 40% reduction down there. Is that happening, or is it just a soundbite? I want to see what role we can play in the same way. What we do on our landscape affects many of our American neighbors. So I'm hoping that many of the things I've heard about in terms of all the Great Lakes Cities Initiative and people working together, can find a way to work together on that, rather than, you say, well, not our business. Well, no, we can hopefully play a role, and that's my hope. I don't expect the zones to extend because just like the St. Lawrence Seaway, we've had a great role, even though we can't make them do anything. Yeah. So that's my hope and my vision that way.
Thank you for that. Thank you for this report.
Thank you for that, Councillor Rigby. And with the committee's indulgence, I intend to bring forward the 2 consent items for information immediately following Jamie's presentation, just because of the water treatment plant relevance to the presentation. Councillor Augustine.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation. Appreciate you answering all the questions. My question is, what did you say at the very end when you talked about the signs, something about the province?
Oh, pardon me.
And regarding these signs.
Okay. So in regards to signs, what was through you, Mr. Chair, what was identified when we were looking at, if I could go back, just build the context. So when a technical report was done on threats and zones, there's a lot of highways, there's a lot of roads in Niagara, and both members of your water staff as well as on our committee, were like, what are we going to do about roads? And the province didn't want roads part of the thinking. They like to deal with static threats, a landfill, a dump or something, not moving. But we pushed them and we were able to add on. You're allowed to have locally added threats, said we want to do something about these highways. So the first starting point was through the province, through MTO, said, can we put some signs in the highways so that people know when you're driving on the Highway 406, hey, that's an intake protection zone. First responders, application of road salt. These are areas where there needs to be a different initiative taken in terms of protection. If there was a leaky tanker, let's get it out of that area, at least leak somewhere, not into the supply. So there are 4 signs that have been placed by the Minister of Transportation on Highway 406, on either side near the DeQ intake and Lake Gibson, as well as on either side of the old Welland Canal work process there. And then that's part of a policy that was directed to the province. There's also a policy directed primarily at Niagara Region to facilitate with the local municipalities around Port Colborne, Welland, Niagara Falls, and Thorold to also add on signage that way. And the success has already been in Port Colborne because it's our most urban intake, so they prioritize that one. Does that
That's helpful. I guess then that leads to my next question, Mr. Chair, and I'm not sure it's for the presenter, but it's for staff. So do we follow those protocols as a result of those zones? Do we have, if there's an accident in that area, do we take that out? Does our, response, that fire response, do we change the way we salt in those areas on the roads? Can we just hear for 30 seconds from Mr. Tripp on that?
Through you, Chair, the short answer would be yes. We have regard for those areas and those zones. And in fact, there's a couple of recent examples. The most recent unfortunate fire in Port Colborne, where we are very mindful of the effluent from the fire suppression and whether that would go to the canal. Another example that just happens to be Port Colborne is we've over a number of years worked with the City of Port Colborne and the St. Lawrence Seaway to have a very specific emergency response plan when there's some kind of leak from a ship that's in the canal. So just 2 examples that in those unique circumstances where we know they're within the sensitive zone where we take specific precautions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And through you to Jamie, thanks for the presentation. I just want to take a moment to thank the previous committee, Councillor Rigby, and the engineer in charge of the process, Brian Wright, and the Conservation Authority's staff that helped make this happen, as we noted here. I think first in the province and second to get the full recognition of the second in the province to have the plan approved. There was considerable effort and a lot of money from the province to get that set in place. So the funding model now that it's kind of a maintenance, what's the funding model now that it's a maintenance approach?
The funding model is something through you, Mr. Chair, I as a project manager, the other project managers across the province have certainly been encouraging the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change to be more explicit about. And they have not been because there's a lot going on. There are many plans that are still being worked out the details. So those of us at the front, they're not quite sure. So we're waiting to hear what the funding will be. Will it be 4 meetings, that committee? Will it only be 2 meetings? And I'm hoping that they'll continue to envisage what they talked about, which was continual improvement. Now, another change in funding is, well, that 800,000 plus that was provided to Niagara Region to map the intake protection zones and other associated things. Now the municipal class environmental assessment process has been amended, and it says when you're making changes to your plant, you need to consider source water protection. And your staff has already been proactive in that. Ms. Croswell and I worked together with your project manager last December that your RFP for the Welland plant would have in it that the consultant doing that work would map the new intake protection zones as part of that, because that's the right time to do it rather than remobbing afterwards. And your staff have also been involved with the province, who have been consulting on a new regulation for that, going what order works best, and they've been very vocal to try to make sure the province thinks about that. So that change in funding is that now the municipalities have to pay for the new mapping of zones. That's a significant change. But the good news, as Councillor, I got to read your names, I'm talking a lot here, Councillor Quirk said, the changes to most of your intake protection zones will actually lessen the threats and lessen the risk. So that's a good news, that the decisions being made by your staff either have to or wanting to are lessening the risk.
So the province will continue to fund the operation of the committee. Any remapping will be paid for by the region and paid to the conservation or to the Clean Water Protection Authority. How's that going to flow?
I believe, through you, Mr. Chair, is that, for example, if we use the Welland example, as part of your EA there, the consultant will be paid to remap the zones, and then those zones will be provided to the Source Protection Authority to go into a report.
Okay.
And part of that along the way is we're going to help with the datum, all those in the trees sort of details.
All right. Okay, so my second question is about the signs along the roads are designed to make it clear that if there's a spill, you're spilling into a source water protection zone. And we have the seaways significantly involved, and voluntarily is what you said. So it's one of those subjects that we need to raise with the federal government in terms of the terms of the new seaway management. Yes, Councillor Burrows, never let it go. The Seaway Management Authority has a contract with the federal government that doesn't yet include this because this is kind of new. And so we need to be sure that the new contract between the federal government and the Seaway Management includes a mandatory compliance with these provincial kind of regulations. I don't know if we're the only place in the province where source water comes out of a seaway body of water as directly as the canal. I guess they all come out of lakes, so. But I just want to ask that the Public Works take note of that, and perhaps the CAO, because that's one item that needs to be in that collection of issues we need to bring to the federal government in terms of the new seaway. They have been fairly cooperative, and they know that's a sort of an obligation, but I don't like to hear that it's voluntary. And so I just want to ask that that be noted, Mr. Chairman.
Sir Tim's noted. Councillor Grenier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize that Parenthood and my other job sort of interfered for a few minutes, and apologize for being a little bit late, but I did want to make a couple quick comments on this. Firstly, with respect to Councillor Augustine and Councillor Rigby's questions, I think that we should be truly grateful here with our legislative roles at how deeply integrated the incident management and emergency response plans and the source water protection plan is integrated, and that the knowledge and the sharing of knowledge between the first responders and the source water protection, and how well established that is with respect to the incidents that the Commissioner highlighted and so on. I think that, and perhaps maybe for comfort at another time, having Chief Smith actually come through that plan and actually present it either to Corp or wherever that would go through up to councils. I think it's important for council to understand how many other departments feed into that, in particular with the work that the Source Protection Committee does. Also, I think that Mr. Campbell is far too modest with the success of this group. I can't go anywhere in Ontario without people telling me how deep, cooperative, and well done our source protection plan is. We were among the first in the province, but it is usually held up as one of the models for other authorities to emulate. And also on that, the depth of talent from people who are volunteers that show up at these meetings. Actually, I enjoy going to these meetings. And it's not as if I'm looking for more meetings to go to, but I actually enjoy going to these meetings, and it's truly a pleasure to serve and work with these citizens with their area of expertise and the contribution they've made. To the last question that Councillor Burrows raised with respect to being complete, I think other than the political sensitivities that would accompany it with some of our more rural municipalities, I think the idea of actually looking at the need to look at
wells and how they contribute to, and the area around them contributes to source protection is something we're going to have to confront, as I believe that within this or the next term or cycle of these source protection plans, we're going to have to probably engage on that level, and we should start doing the work in consultation with our lower tier partners accordingly, so that we can finesse that and understand the property rights and the political and the inspection protocols that go with that. But I believe it's something that we need to do. But again, just to thank the committee members and to enjoy being there. And I think that we should be very comfortable that we are well served by the people involved in this project. Thank you.
Questions there, Mr. Campbell? Take that and run. Compliments. Councilor Luciani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First
Sorry,
of all,
I meant take the compliments and run. Not literally run. Councilor Luciani.
thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I apologize for being late, and this question might have been asked, so I may be asking a question that was previously brought forward. Anyways, I just want to talk about phosphorus blooms in Lake Erie. As we know, the western basin of Lake Erie is terribly infested with them, and it's coming our way. It's already been, it's here. And I'm wondering basically the first question, what are we doing with regards, how do they affect, first of all, how do they affect our drinking water and our filtration plants? And I'm talking specific to the equipment that we use to filter our water.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I could speak to part of that question, but part of that question will have to be from your operational staff.
Okay.
First off, the update that was submitted to the province last November for the second go of source water identified that as an issue. And the provincial staff didn't want us to have it in there, but we said we're putting it in there. We want to see if we can play a role in the Lake Erie water that we're receiving to make sure it's of good quality. Because very little of the land in Niagara drains to Lake Erie. It's just a small strip along the Lake Erie shoreline. And then the other further thing I will mention, just to compliment your staff, since 2010, Niagara Region Public Works Water has been doing a lot more monitoring and organizing. It's making it much easier to look at the data in terms of phosphorus, algae. Microcystin is this item you look for as evidence of negative effects from the algae. So that baseline information is being collected better to be able to look at if things are happening. As to the effect at your water treatment plants, that would be outside of my expertise to speak at. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation and your time answering questions. Well done. Thank you. Committee, I'd like to ask Jen Croswell, our water compliance specialist, to come forward, and maybe we can move PWC C3 and C4 forward on the agenda. Moved by Councillor Rigby, seconded by Councillor Volpatti. Jen, do you want to just go ahead and give us a few minutes of overview of the reports? And I'm sure Councillor Rigby at least has one question before we approve it.
Through you, Mr. Chair, not a problem. So I've put through two memos today to committee. The first being an overview of responsibilities of the Clean Water Act, which Jamie did a great job at presenting an overview of the legislation as a whole, in part our responsibilities at the regional level as well. The second memo that I brought forward to committee has to do with regulatory reporting to committee that is mandated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, so we're switching legislation here. And this is to provide information about the summary reports that are completed on an annual basis. And in addition to that, it also outlines any non-compliances that have been found through inspection for the current fiscal year of the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change of our drinking water systems.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions or comments for Jen? Councillor Rigby, do you want to ask your question about the Port Colborne plant?
I think that within that, within the report itself, you indicated the 5 operations being compliant to 100%. Port Colborne being an issue which were occurrences. And am I correct in reading that and certainly what we heard at the last presenter and some of the questions or comments being made is were you satisfied with the operation and the cleanup and the actions that were taken in order to restrict that from getting into the source water for the remainder, which is probably more to the point, to DEQ or to Welland plant and to the DEQ plant? That seems to indicate that there was no overflow into the source water that receives at Welland and St. Catharines.
So through you, Mr. Chair, the incident involved that came up as a non-compliance in our inspection report,
Yeah.
the non-compliance is actually related to a section of our municipal drinking water license that was not complied with in the eyes of the ministry. Speaking to the event in particular, this isn't a routine event that occurs. The draining of this particular tank was done in order to do some maintenance work on a piece of equipment that would remove sludge, so then this type of discharge doesn't occur. So ironically, unfortunately, through the maintenance to prevent this type of discharge, this discharge did occur. Since that date, work has been done, including locking out of essential valves to ensure that this doesn't happen again. In addition to that, we're also looking at an engineered solution. We currently have an upgrade in the near future for our Port Colborne water treatment plant, and in that there will be a feasibility study to see what we can do in order to prevent, let me rephrase that, in order to rework the flow of water within that tank to ensure that any discharges are being taken care of through other processes in the plant, such as taken right to sanitary instead of to the environment. So while we wait for that to occur, we also have implemented procedures in place where we have contingency to either bring in a vacuum truck to actually physically remove and discharge to sanitary, or we can discharge to another tank that can hopefully redirect to sanitary.
Well, thank you for that. I guess when you refer to discharge, was the discharge into the Welland Canal? And if so, how was it contained there?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, the discharge was to the Welland Canal.
Yeah.
With our sampling procedures that we need to conduct anytime we do a discharge, because discharges do occur, typically it's from a different part of the process. So because of the discharge to the environment, sampling is completed on the day, results don't come until after the fact. So we learned of the actual results of the total suspended solids, which was the parameter of concern. I believe it was 2 days after the discharge event. We provided all of the information to the Ministry of the Environment, and with that there was a review by their hydrologist, and it was concluded that there was not an adverse water quality impact to that local area. So I would use that to infer that further downstream there was not an impact to the other water treatment plants.
Okay, I guess that doesn't answer what my question
Sorry.
is. What was the action that was taken by the first responders, I guess, and others, to prevent it from spreading any further into the water stream?
Through you, Mr. Chair, at the time of the event, it wasn't known that we were in an exceedance state. So other than the routine sampling, there were no additional actions that were taken.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Jen, Councillor Luciani had asked the previous presenter about the phosphorus bloom and the impact on our water treatment facilities, if any.
Yep, so through you, Mr. Chair. So the actual phosphorus, I wouldn't, through my knowledge and experience, I wouldn't say that phosphorus specifically is an issue in our water treatment plant from a treatability perspective in terms of impacting our equipment or our infrastructure. It's the algal growth that can come as a result of that may cause impacts. That being said, we do have a multi-barrier process in place in our plants. So we have a chlorination process at the head of our plant in order to try to limit the growth of algae throughout the rest of the process. There's always effects that need to be weighed for every process that's in place. So if there was an event where there was an algal bloom and microsystem was of a concern, we do have a monitoring procedure in place where we would possibly limit our chlorination at the front of the plant in order to mitigate any adverse effects of microcystin and hopefully removal and mitigate that concern throughout the process. But other than that, I would just say that it is a treatable parameter, phosphorus itself. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Councillor Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the previous discussion, we talked about the taking and closing the water supply from the canal over to the DQ treatment plant in pipes. I think to protect that canal, that little supply canal from runoff of phosphorus from farmers' field, did that, what instigated that action? And it's a public works project that we've already approved, I assume.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure of the impetus to launch that project in particular. I'm wondering if perhaps I can defer.
You can help with that.
Through you, Chair, so it is derivative of the risk assessment we've done overall with the source protection. It went more specifically into its own initiative. It hasn't been completely approved by council. It's shown in our capital forecast, and I can't recall exactly when. We've done pieces of it, certain strategic pieces of it already, but in terms of extending the closed-in portion of it, that'll be for subject of future budget considerations with this council.
So it was, through Mr. Chairman, it was one of the risks identified by this whole source water protection process of mapping out where the risks are.
Correct.
I remember the one in Port Colborne where they had a fueling spill into the canal upstream from the Port Colborne intake. And I think I think it was in the middle of the process of the source water protection, and that was part of the reason and part of the value of it. We were all way back there. We thought it was because the Walkerton incident and the mismanagement of one well. But as a result of the whole process, the whole re-examination of everybody's systems has proven very valuable, just because it's given us the result we see today with dealing with the spill on the seaway and our own water canal running through farmers' fields from the canal to DQ. So it's just an illustration of the value of this kind of work. And again, want to compliment the staff of the Source Water Protection Authority and the committee for the work they've done and the results it's producing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jen. Seeing no further, want to go again? We already have both have been moved and seconded, so we're just going to be receiving the reports. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Thank you very much. Okay, moving back to items for consideration. May I have a mover for PW 6 2018, the Welland Wastewater Treatment Plant Phase 1 upgrades? Any mover and second? Moved by Councillor Diodati, seconded by Councillor Marshall. Any questions or comments? Councillor Augustine.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A lot of this appears to be to handle contract administration. So the contractor that's overseeing this, so it appears, let's put it this way, it appears that the contractor that's overseeing this is benefiting by a delay. So can we hear just a little bit more about that? Why wouldn't the contract, so the folks doing the work are specifically on a contract, they have a price, a set price. Why wouldn't the contract administration have a set price?
Commissioner.
Through Chair, so yeah, there's a couple of elements to that I'll touch on. In terms of the contract administrator or the vendor, yes, their assignment is based on time, and that is pretty typical of the structure in which we have the agreements with consulting firms to do these things, or at least it has been historically, rather than a fixed base. It is established that way early on in the process when the scope of work is not yet determined through the design process. So through a competitive process, we establish a time-based charge rate for contract administration and inspection services. And then just a couple of things I'll add to that. Another element that is embedded in our construction contracts, which would be with a general contractor, is there is also penalties associated with going beyond what is anticipated the time for the project. So you make informed assumptions on how long a project's going to take, and you base a budget for contract administration based on that. So there is what we refer to as liquidated damages associated with delays as well. All of that will be assessed at the end. So there's financial considerations through liquidated damages to the general contractor. Throughout the process and at the final outcome, we will assess accountability and responsibility for delays. There'd be likely be a portion of this that could be assessed against the general contractor. There could in fact be a portion of this could be assessed against the design performance of the consultant themselves. We will reconcile that at the end. But we had, through a previous project, based on a similar structured contract, advice, external legal advice that because of the nature and the structure of which the procurement was between the region and the vendor, we were obliged to continue to pay for those services with the expectation and I guess qualification that there be this reconciliation at the end to cover those costs.
Thank you. I followed everything except for the final where he said we were expected to pay for those services. Which services were we expected to pay for? Is that the consulting engineer, the contract admin part?
That's correct. Contract administration and inspection.
Okay. I know it's hard to put the crystal ball in, but do we expect that the liquidated damages would pay then for the contract admin, or they really don't kick in until August?
Through you, Chair, yes, that is the expectation. That's when we assign those fees through the general contract. It's based on assumptions that it will cover the additional contract admin services going forward. I don't have the crystal ball, especially with these two, this project as well as the one that's following it, just because of the unique challenges that we're facing. But it is the expectation that the cost recovery would be handled through that. It's also a pretty confident expectation that the general contractor is going to fight against that or resist those charges as well.
Okay, thank you. So this only kicks in if we go past that date. Is that correct, the August date?
Through you, Chair, this is what we expect to be the cost of services to get us to the completion of the contract, correct?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it is a confusing bit of business here. What are the consequences of Vercon's refusal to sign the changeover? Now, the fact that they refused it, and are we bordering on something that should be done in camera? Because we have two projects, significant in nature, and it may involve potential litigation down the road. So I'm not sure what questions to ask and what not to ask.
Shot at the change order question.
Through you, Chair, I don't think will cross the line to say that any challenge of executing that change order, which specifically relates to extension of days and liquidated damage, will likely be a legal matter. And we'd have to talk about those risks in closed session.
And do I understand this contract now goes to the end of 2018, or are we looking at October or August?
Through Chair, as indicated in the report, the current version of the schedule contemplates September of 2018.
Yes, September 2018. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up through the refusal to sign the change order. The change order was in effect, they refused to say they could complete by August 17th and came back and said we can complete by September 24th. The change order was simply the completion date.
Through you, Chair, Council may recall this was the subject of a previous report to them. That change order had to do with a number of things. Most specifically was the agreement to a schedule, which was the August date for completion. But the most important element of that was It included a sign-off, formal sign-off from the major sub-trades to commit to that schedule as well. So that part of it was actually achieved, although, as indicated in the report, we've now seen some slippage. The portion of contention for the general contractor was through that change order, waiving any rights to claim for because of the additional days required for them to complete the project. So we didn't reach agreement on that.
Okay.
And that's legally we will sort through to the end.
Okay. So that was my concern. It's simply about the schedule, and they knew they couldn't or refused to commit to the one date. And if there's now it's us to sign a change order agreeing to the September 4th date. Is that the next step? Or to reissue a change order committing them to this September 24?
Commissioner.
Through you, Chair, I don't want to go too far in terms of my comments in open session, other than to say that in terms of our assessment of liquidated damages, we are still looking at the August date.
Oh, okay. So that's the legal issue. And the second question is that the recommended approach here about extending the contract of the supervising engineering firm is a unusual practice, or is that a standard practice across the province?
Commissioner.
Through you, Chair, it's the norm in terms of practice in dealing with these types of situations. What perhaps seems unusual to the council is prior to, say, 3 years ago anyway, it was done, the reporting to council was retroactive after it had been done. Because of our commitment-based accounting system we now have in place, it's brought to council for transparency in advance of authorizing such payment.
No, thank you. That's helpful. I mean, as you say, it wasn't that way before, but now we're ahead of it a bit, at least aware of it. Not that we can do much about it, I think, but we are aware of it as it happens. So I appreciate that improvement in this process. Thanks.
Councillor Sendzik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and a lot of the questions have already been asked. Just a couple quick ones. In terms of any holdbacks related to the contract, do we have an adequate amount through to the Commissioner of final holdbacks that would help us recoup some of these costs?
Commissioner.
Through you, Chair, with this contract, in addition to our statutory lien holdbacks, which are very specific in terms of their disposition, we've been, and these have been the subject of previous reports to council, we've been managing holdbacks assessed against liens on the project. In addition, as with this and the subsequent project, we have a 5% maintenance holdback for the entire value of the contract, which is considerable in both cases.
Okay, so that's helpful in terms of providing some risk management. In terms of one other question, some of the issues that we've seen in the city of St. Catharines is earlier contracts and builds that took place, say the four-pad. How can we protect against shoddy work? Where is that what the role of Cole Engineering is to ensure that the materials being used, the grade of concrete being poured, and all that is what actually has been tendered, so that we're not looking at this 10 years from now and seeing holes in the pipes and things like that?
Through you, Chair, yes, it would be the short answer, and if with the Chair's indulgence, I'm going to actually skip between the two reports slightly. So in this particular contract, the well and wastewater, I'd suggest that we're being very proactive in terms of deficiencies identified instantaneously and rejected immediately and dealt with prior to proceeding on with construction. It wasn't as much the case in the Niagara Lake project where they were more reactive. We just kept a list of outstanding items and then basically a list that has to be dealt with in terms of deficiencies. In the case of Niagara on the Lake, subject to that report, which is next, we are not going to accept inferior, and it's, as I've said before, it's going to be a painful process to get to the completion of the project, but we will not accept inferior product or workmanship. In the case of Welland, so the answer to the question, yes, we're being very, I'll call it dogmatic about the review of quality and workmanship as we go, and rejecting as we go, which is part of the time challenge that we have, but we're simply not going to accept unsatisfactory.
Okay, and that provides additional assurance. And is the company in question, do they have any other contracts that is underway, or is this the only project that they're working on? in the region?
Through you, Chair, well, I'm referring to the general contractor. They have two projects where the subject three technically, with the region of Niagara, and they are the subject of these two reports. No other projects are they doing for us at the moment.
Okay, and one further question moving forward. If we experience these kind of issues with a company, when it comes to future procurement projects, is there a mechanism in which we're able to at least create a category that would flag these type of issues? Because this would be a concern to me as an individual, as a board member, that a company like this would continue to get further work when they've shown that there's a significant potential deficiency in their abilities to follow through.
Through your chair, yes, and there's, I think, a couple of different avenues in which we're approaching that, and specifically the Procurement Advisory Committee, looking at our process for pre-qualification and how we assess performance of contractors. That we're actually made quite great strides in terms of tightening up that system. A specific example, we recently, Council approved the award of a construction project, which was the rehabilitation of the water treatment plant in the town of Fort Erie, Rose Hill Treatment Plant. That went through a pre-qualification process. This particular vendor didn't make it through that pre-qualification process based on recent experiences.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think this really does show that we're tightening up a lot of our procurement processes, and I would like to thank the Commissioner for a lot of what would appear to be risk management on a project of this size, so that we can show the public we're heading in the right direction when it comes to managing these kind of projects.
Thank you, Councillor Senza. Councillor Redekop.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are there outstanding construction liens with respect to this project?
Through you, Chair, I apologize. I don't remember that specific detail, but I don't believe there's an outstanding lien on this project at the moment. I believe there is with Niagara Lake.
But we do have outside legal advice with respect to this project?
Through you, Chair, actually, I don't want to put Ms. Gibbs on the spot. She's recently taken advisory role for us from a legal perspective on this, as well as the other Niagara Lake project. We're actually evaluating at the moment the retention of an external firm to carry us through all what we expect to be the legal processes.
Can I offer some free legal advice? Get some outside counsel on this. Looking at the construction progress to date, it's inescapable that this is not going to be done in August, probably not even September. What happens if this project goes on and on?
That's for you, Chair. Unfortunately, it's similar to both of the projects that we're dealing with. If we were only reliant upon the primary subtrades, the schedule that's been submitted, it was probably achievable. We think it's realistic. It's the coordination from the general, as well as any issues with payment or delays for mobilization at the site continue to complicate both projects, and that's been articulated in public reports previously. So we put it forward in terms of that is the legitimate scale that's been tabled for this project. I can only say that if the appropriate resources are put to bear, it is achievable. Our experience hasn't been that, though.
Right, and I think that's the predicament. If we just go on the past history, it's unlikely these targets are going to be hit. Which gets me to my final question. How large is the performance bond with respect to this contract?
Through Chair, it's 100% performance and material and performance bond, which is typical of a Niagara contract.
Thank you very much.
Actually, through the chair, just a suggestion. I misspoke earlier. It was reference to a question, I believe, from Councillor Augustine. There is detail in the financial consideration of the report itself specific to this project. A portion of the funds being approved for consideration for approval are to get us to actually August. So it's extraordinary effort just to get us to what was contemplated as the original completion. And then another portion of that funding is to take us to the end of 2018, which we anticipate is more realistic completion.
Thank you. Councillor Caslin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And although a lot of the questions have already been asked, just a logistical question, just to break it down in simplest terms. If we were expecting liquidated damages to come back, why would we, are we going to, as a council, see a credit coming back of $416,000, or are we simply going to pay it out and not hear anything back from it?
Through you, Chair, council wouldn't normally see that. It would be administered through the contract as a change order, as a credit, as opposed to an additional cost. But we haven't crossed that bridge yet. We're going to, that's on the consideration going forward.
Do we keep a ledger of sorts whereby we have our extras and our credits, and in our credits, do we have our liquidated damages?
Through you, Chair, we do, as part of the administration of the project itself. Not normally the subject of updates to committee, but that's pretty straightforward information in terms of the administration of the contract.
So again, just breaking it down simply, is the $416,000 that's being asked for today over and above that balance sheet expenses and credits?
At current state, yes, it is. To be, as I said earlier on, to be reconciled before the end of the project.
If that's the case, then, if we don't achieve our liquidated damages for whatever reason, will you be coming back and asking for money to compensate for liquidated damages that have not been received?
Sorry, this specifically approves the budget amendment for an incremental cost. Should we be successful through legal routes, and there's a number of those to be subject to further updates, it'll be a positive variance downward.
Okay, thank you for that. My second question, Mr. Chair, is about the schedule slides, and it appears that we've seen schedules sliding in just about every project that we undertake. And I'm wondering what kind of resources as a region we put forward towards those. I know that on contract administration, we have an administrator, we have all kinds of engineering support behind that, and soils testing experts and so on. What kind of resources do we put behind the scheduling such that we try and limit the slippage in the schedules?
Through Chair, respectfully suggest to the committee that these two projects that we're discussing, this report that's before us, are extraordinary examples in terms of the challenges we faced, and they've been the subject of both open and closed session reports. Specific to the question, through our procurement process, through our rostering process, we have tightened up the expectation for the design assignment and the establishment of the legitimate schedule for projects to ensure that we are managing the expectation with the council and with the public.
Well, thank you for that. But we know that as schedules slip, it costs us money. So we know that every project that has a schedule slide in it is going to result in an extra cost of some sort. Perhaps we should engage our performance organization to see what we can do to improve that process of scheduling, to make sure that we limit any slides in scheduling, or perhaps we set the schedule a little more generous up front so that we don't have a schedule slide at the end.
Through you, Chair, take full note of the comment and the suggestion. I just want to, for committee's benefit, for context, recall a report that was submitted last year, 2017, to committee, which was basically a 3-year assessment of our performance over contracts. So while, unfortunately, the projects that have challenges are before this committee and garner rightful discussion, over the last 3 years, we've actually been positive in terms of surplus to our budgeted numbers to the, I think, on average 9%, which also translates to being within both time and budget. So overall, in terms of the entire capital portfolio, we're actually doing quite well in terms of average. It's unfortunate that we have these exceptional circumstances that are the subject of discussion with the committee.
Yeah, and you're right, through you, Mr. Chair, that we don't hear about all the projects that we've successfully completed. We only hear about the bad ones because obviously there's action for council to take place. So in that light, what would you consider to be our record as a percentage of projects complete or value of projects successfully versus the projects that land here on our desk?
Well, through you, Chair, and I can revisit the report that was produced, but the vast majority are actually within budget and within time, resulting in basically a surplus situation overall over the last 3 years. And that nets out against, like, some are actually significantly within budget or within time. In order for us to be at an average of 9% surplus, that's offsetting these that are problematic and go beyond time and cost extra.
So I think it's a positive, and you know, the adage that you can't manage what you don't measure, perhaps we should put a performance measure in place that manages percentage of contracts or value of contracts that have problems versus those that we're successful, so that we can keep our eye on it. So thank you.
Councillor Diodati.
Thank you, Chair. First off, I would concur with Councillor Redekop that I think we need to go deal with outside legal that specializes in this type of a situation. We don't want to get ourselves into a situation as we may have in the past. My question through you, Chair, is when we deal with deficient performers or poor quality workmanship, do we share this type of data with the local area municipalities? I know we know internally when we're trying to rate future bids, but do we share this information with the local municipal works departments?
Through you, Chair, I'm going to try to be sensitive to this. There certainly is an informal communication network within our peer group. We rightfully need to be careful in terms of documentation that we share. We are only just now embarking on a vendor rating system for both general contracting and with a view to move that into consulting services as well. So I wouldn't suggest that the region has a robust objective rating system in place yet, which would be sort of the documentation that we would share with others and be quite comfortable with defending that information. What tends to be the case more often is when a local or even one of our peer in other jurisdictions is looking to retain a new entity, whether it be consulting or general contracting, they make phone calls and do reference checks just as we do. And we would share the experience we had on a particular project. It's straightforward and objective information.
Thank you for that sensitive answer. And the other part that I would ask is, since this group is not meeting their milestones, it doesn't look like they're going to be meeting their milestones. At what point do we cut bait? At what point? Because it seems to me it's not going in the right direction. Does that point come?
Commissioner?
Through you, Chair, any discussion along that line, I'd prefer to be in closed session. But what I can commit to committee is, I've already referenced that I'm working with with our legal counsel to establish an external vendor to provide basically legal support services. I would commit to this committee that I'll be coming back once that is in place and we've done some work to give an update from a closed session update on both of these projects in terms of where we're at and expectations moving forward on next steps.
Councillor Grenier.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick questions and comments. This particular plant was named by the Environmental Defense Fund 6 or 7 years ago for discharges without treatment into the Welland River. And it is part of the service. It is a service for an area that's undergoing a great deal of development, and my resentment of most of them paying taxes to the city of Thorold. But as a Welland councillor, but the idea here is, the question I have is, when do these delays become a problem for development that's ongoing now, and when do we address the issues of capacity as a result of this? And if you need to be in camera without giving anything away on that, my comment to you through you, Mr. Chair, would be any further updates. I really would like some sort of calendar answer or specific details on that of when we reach that tipping point of being this delay being a problem for the large amount of development around the area that's of single-family houses that would be feeding volume into this plant. And from a council perspective, I think it's an important fact that we would need to evaluate how we would move forward on what kind of speed we would move forward on any litigation that might be necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Grenier. Councillor Rigby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We certainly have been faced with some involvement in some of these larger projects that we have had, and in most cases, in some of the cases, I should say, we had in the past been faced with, which has already been said, with an after the fact, oh, by the way, we had to increase budget because we have to meet it. This process now is showing ahead of time, we need to be prepared to pay possibly money, and that we want to have the budget in place in the event that comes forward, so which gives us a heads up as to what's going on. And I think that's the positive part of what the process is and the tendering process that is going on. It is changing, and the management is getting much better, and it's becoming more open. Just a question related to the ongoing process as you look into the future, where we have these large projects that in some cases are rebuilds and trying to upgrade and so on. Is our contingency piece adequate to support that kind of what-ifs in the future? And is it something that we should be looking at when we're looking at procurement and how we go forward?
Commissioner?
Through you, Chair, on the contingency piece, yes, that has actually been specifically identified actually through the Burgoyne Value for Money work, that we look at a more strategic approach to establishing contingencies. But I think more to the councillor's point about managing risk with these complex projects with existing facilities. A couple of process changes that have already put in place that I've spoken to previously. A much more collaborative work with the design process with our operations staff, right. So we truly understand how we're going to keep this plant functioning through a construction project. So that has certainly been improved in recent years. As well, it's not technically a peer review process, but we have actually created the discipline of at various key points in the design process to actually engage another engineer, an independent engineer, to review the work as well as our own staff to basically manage risk and identify these things up front and hopefully come away with a better tendered project that is less problematic.
When you bring in another engineer, where does the cost for that come from on a particular project? How would you fund that?
That is captured in the capital budget of the project itself.
So you'd be building that into your budget process?
Correct.
Thank you.
And just for committee's context, is a fairly nominal cost in the context of the budget for construction. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's policing or practicing gotcha with a particular consulting firm. It's just a more thorough review of what we're doing and how it's going to work in an operational sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Volpatti.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm happy that we're working through some of these procurement issues in a positive way. And my question is, and I'm assuming that this is going to be the case, but I want to ask anyway. I'm assuming that as we go forward with other projects, that the experience that we've had with certain contractors is going to have an impact on what kind of tenders we accept and look at. I don't know if I've made that clear.
Through you, Chair, I believe it's clear to me, both the nature of the tenders that we do as well as our pre-qualification process has been impacted by these experiences, yes.
Right, so we can legally do that. We can legally say, because we've had a bad experience with you in the past, we are not going to look at your tender as we would others.
Through Chair, and the Chair and I are just discussing, and largely being led by the Procurement Advisory Committee, I don't want to prejudice any particular vendor, but performance on past projects is a part of that objective assessment that we can utilize,
Right.
yes.
And just going on with that for a moment, and is it a significant enough part of that process that it would eliminate someone because of our past experience?
Through you, Chair, I would suggest to committee that, yes, it has eliminated some folks on both the pre-qualification I referenced earlier, as well as our rostering process for consulting services.
Okay, and just one further thing. If we get a reference asked from someone else in the province about a certain contractor, would we be forthcoming as to what our experience has been? Through you, Chair.
Through you, Chair, subject to consultation with legal services, I would certainly have no issue describing any challenges that we've had with our project.
Good. Thank you very much for that.
Seeing no further questions or comments, the motion is on the floor. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Councillor Rigby, the next item on the floor, and then I'm going to ask you to give me a few-minute break. So can I get a mover and a seconder for PW7, the budget adjustment and status update for the Niagara on the Lake wastewater treatment plant? Moved by Councillor Burrows, seconded by Councillor Luciani. Any questions or comments? Councillor Burrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the report. Just a couple of clarifications. Would it be possible, there are two different programs. One is the pumping stations, one is the sewage plant. I know you referred to them by the code word, but would it be possible in brackets just to put one, at least once on the report saying, this is the main treatment plant, these are the pumping stations? Is that possible?
Through you, Chair, I would expect to be bringing another update to committee in the summertime. And yes, I think I can provide a little bit more simple clarification.
I know them, but not everybody would. And we seem to be transferring back and forth. My main question was, while we have reduced the pumping stations by 400,000 into capital reserve, a capital variance, we're taking 220,000 of that 400, and we're taking the other 180 out of development charges. Is that the only way we can do the accounting? Why wouldn't we have just reduced the one by 220 and moved it over? And how does development charges, how do they get into the play?
Through you, Chair, I'll take a stab at it if I understood correctly. In terms of the proportional amount from either the wastewater rates, basically, or the development charges, that sharing or splitting of costs was established early on in the project based on how much was benefit to existing and how much was truly for development support.
That's fine. And I was going to respond to Councillor Grenier if he was here, but I'll respond anyway. There he is. Certainly at local, Councillor Grenier.
Councillor Grenier, you should be paying attention to what's being asked.
In Niagara on the Lake, the issue of what we always used to call sewage allotment comes up, especially because of the delays. And almost every project that comes forward is mentioned, do we have enough capacity? So they treat it very seriously, and I assume they do also in Welland. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There being no further questions, I'll call the question to the motion. All those in favor? Opposed? It is carried. Next item on the agenda is PWC 3? Oh, PW 8, sorry, 218. Can I have a motion? Councillor Luciani, and thank you. And discussion? Councillor, sorry, Castlin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as former chair of the what used to be the cycling committee in at the region, I can assure you that the money that's being asked for St. David's Road interchange is very worthwhile and something that was contemplated for a long, long time because of the dangers that exist because of the 406 and the St. David's Road being a high-speed road, or at least higher speed than a city street. And with Brock University located right at the end, it makes a big difference. I'll also take the, as an avid cyclist myself, I'll also take the time to recognize the fact that Niagara Region will be participating in the Toronto Bike Show at the C&E grounds, and that'll be not this weekend, but next weekend, where I'll invite everybody to come and have a look at what cycling means in Niagara, and how others in the province are viewing Niagara in terms of our cycling ability. So back to the motion, I think it's very worthwhile, and I think it's something that we're becoming known for, not only in Niagara, but throughout the province and Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call the question. Oh, Councillor Luciani, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you know, there's a three-way funding partnership with the region, St. Catharines and Thorold, for two of these items, the interchange and Highway 40658 to Collier Road. As a three-way funding partnership. How will the funding, the city's funding, be affected by these new dollars that have been garnered?
Through you, Chair. I'll start with, I don't expect the city's anticipated contribution to have changed. What we're doing with the funds that the region has received through this program is substituting what would otherwise been levy money for the portion that we were going to contribute.
So that could go down.
Yeah. And I can't speak for Thorold. There's already been an approval through that council for budget allocation. I'm not familiar with the numbers. I understand that Thorold's been, as well as St. Catharines, have been recipient of this funding through this program as well. They may choose to offset that contribution to these two projects, or they may choose to invest in elsewhere. But in terms of the contribution from the three funding partners, it should not have changed by virtue of this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Augustine.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I recall a presentation by some members of Brock University's student union requesting this and some other changes which we have done and the City of Thorold has done as well. I just wondered if we can add a friendly amendment to this, that we also circulate the report to the Brock University Student Union and to Brock University itself.
Yeah.
Through Chair, absolutely, yes. I believe actually they'd be aware through the Active Transportation Committee itself, but certainly accept a friendly amendment.
Okay, thank you.
No further questions, so I'll call a question to the motion. All those in favor? Opposed? It is carried. Other business, sorry, other business, yes. Okay. The whole thing? Thank you. We are on other business, and any items for this committee? Being none, Councillor Sendzik?
Just a quick one. I was at the Sustainable Communities Conference in Ottawa, and there was a presentation by Port Coquitlam in BC about their Blackburn Lagoon Park. And I know Councillor Burrows has talked about the conversion of the old lagoons into something and to get the region on board. I would just highlight that for staff to look into the Blackburn Lagoons Park and how they funded it out of the $2.8 million conversion, 1.9 came from the feds. And it is arguably one of the better designed wetland parks that have been created. And if that could be used as a model for the Niagara-on-the-Lake and the region as it works towards the conversion, we should look at that as a best practice. So I can send the information over to Commissioner. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hughes. I was also at the same conference, and there is a concept of sustainable mapping that I'd like to send to staff to talk about how we inventory some of our natural assets and how they feed into our asset management plans moving forward. It is a concept that is likely to be adopted over the next couple of years. It's also been addressed through the PSAB protocols. So I think that it is a worthwhile public policy exercise we may want to engage in moving through our next couple of budget cycles. And the second point on that is I'd like to see if we could, at the next Public Works meeting, get a bit of an update on the motion that I presented with respect to the tree purchasing co-op and the partners across Niagara. And it was that news actually had reached some of the environmental groups that had booths at the Sustainable Communities, and they were looking forward to being engaged for providing assistance on that particular initiative as well. So, good news.
Councillor Grenier, thank you for that. I apologize, I wasn't in my chair when Councillor Sendzik mentioned the particular conference that you were both at. Could you remind me what that was?
The Federation of Canadian Municipalities Sustainable Communities Conference.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything further under other business? Seeing none, there is an item, an in-camera item, matter that is subject to solicitor-client privilege regarding the planned temporary shutdown of the Ontario Power Generation Power Canal in Niagara Falls. Does anyone need to go in camera to discuss this item? Seeing none, can I have, what do I do? Sure, we can. Okay. Motion to go in camera. Moved by Councillor Tim, second by Councillor Joyner. All those in favor? Opposed? It's carried.
Uh, The wording is there. Be referred to, for to the second cycle of this committee for further information and position related to the item.
He can add direction.
If I can suggest that we be more specific and send it to the April 3rd Public Works meeting, and then suggest that staff report on activities and on that point, and then provide an update to us.
Providing that's three, gives a two-cycle meeting, yeah.
You okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to entertain a motion that's moved by Councilor Reed, seconded by Councilor Grenier. Any question or comments to that motion? Everyone understands the motion. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much, and that ends our session for today, and we'll see you back in 3 weeks.
I was right, we are getting stuff for $20 million to relocate.
Yeah.